So the second form of decolonization, let's call that economic decolonization. Okay, so here what we are suggesting is that in order to decolonize a country, not only do we need to seize the state apparatus and put it in the hands of local people, but we also need to think very seriously about the economic policies that are governing the relationship between that country and the former colonial powers. It's no secret that colonial administrations tended to regard the colonies as a source for raw materials and affected very extractive state infrastructure whose goal was to take out of the country, whether it be copper, gold, cotton, rubber, ivory, whatever the case might be, or whether it be human capital in the form of exploited labor or slave labor in some cases. It's no secret that the colonial administration set up an infrastructure to make all the more efficient the delivery of those materials into European hands. To economically decolonize means that we have to think about a reconfiguration of those economic policies so that it's not going to maintain those relationships of power and domination that existed during the high season of colonialism. Now, there is a very long history of writers in the African tradition grappling with this phenomenon and saying that just simply because the colonial powers have withdrawn from the colony doesn't mean that those economic relationships of domination have vanished. And so, for example, the Guyanese writer Walter Rodney is renowned for his work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. The Egyptian writer Samir Amin did a lot of work on this subject, including pioneering and I think popularizing the term Eurocentrism. And then you've got world systems analysis and dependency theory and various other types of economic theories whose goal is to explain how economies in Africa are peripheralized and are oriented towards the benefit of the former colonial powers. I've got a quote here by Frantz Fanon, which I think captures this quite well. This is a very famous quote. You often, when you hear about Fanon, you'll hear something like this. It's from his work, The Wretched of the Earth. He says, "From all these continents under whose eyes Europe today raises up her tower of opulence, there has flowed out for centuries toward that same Europe diamonds and oil, silk and cotton, wood and exotic products. Europe is literally the creation of the third world." So I think that's a sentiment that's, I think, quite widely shared by many writers in the tradition of decolonization from Africa. By the 1980s, you've got a situation in which not only are writers complaining about the persistence of these colonial economic relationships in Africa, but you've got writers like the Nigerian polemicist Chinweizu, or later on the Nigerian Marxist theorist Jaifu, who are saying that old relationship of colonizer and colonized has been finessed into a kind of new economic antagonism, which is the war between creditor and debtor nations, or those who have to restructure and those who have to adjust. And by the 1980s, many African critics are putting pressure on the structural adjustment programs that are being superintended by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Jaifu at one stage even argued that Africa had been virtually recolonized by the Bretton Woods institutions. If you go back to 1965, this is where the relevance of the term neocolonialism comes in. So Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first prime minister of Ghana and an extraordinary contributor to these early discourses around decolonization in Africa, published a book in 1965 called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. And in this book, he writes, and here I quote, he says, "The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty, but in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside." And he goes further to say that a state in the grip of neocolonialism is not a master of its own destiny. So here you have a sense that in order to decolonize in the economic sense, one has to go beyond administration, go beyond political institutions, and one has to interrupt or subvert these asymmetries in wealth and advantage and power that are generated during colonialism. And so neocolonialism is the state in which this vital economic dimension of the phenomenon of decolonization is improperly undertaken. Okay, so we've moved from political decolonization to economic decolonization. We've seen that neocolonialism is a term that's existed for something like 60 years in the African discourse, complaining about this predatory relationship that former colonial powers have continued to deploy in Africa.